What were the V's? What was that giant triangle? Did you know that between 10 o'clock and 10:45 on that very night, another triangle was seen? And it was moving from west to east around Thunderbird Road. And the witness who saw it was a graphic artist, made a wonderful depiction of it, and I have the drawing out there on a poster board, if you see this. And guess what? I got an email on July 13th from a teenager who was camping up near Lake Pleasant, and he described seeing the same kind of triangle with a cutout V. Received reports, scattered reports coming in that these same lights were being seen on March the 7th, not only in the Buckeye Hills, but also north in the Verde Valley. And the description was matching pretty much. On that particular night, we had an appointment to see Dr. Stephen Greer at Village Labs, and he was dubbing tapes. Tom King was to go down there that night and meet with me, and I had just gotten the email address of Steve in Ahwatukee and emailed him, and he called me just before I left the house to give me instructions on how to get down there. I called Tom and I said, make sure you bring your camera. We went down, met at Village Labs, we went through the tape dubbing, we went to have dinner with Dr. Greer, and I started feeling antsy around 8:30, thinking we got to get out of here, we got to go over to Steve's house and see what's going on. It was 8:38 when I last looked at my watch, and we left a few minutes after that and drove the distance to Ahwatukee. If we had left 10 or 15 minutes earlier than that, had gone out on the street, which was University Avenue, we probably would have seen that large structured V at that time. We did not. So we did not know what other people were sighting at that particular time. We had no idea that was going on. When we got to Steve's house, I found something amazing. His door was open, and it seemed like half the neighborhood was traipsing in and out of his house. And I thought, there must be something going on here. And there were a lot of people talking about the strange lights. When we went indoors and we met Steve, one of the first things he said to us was, "You're too late. They were already here. We saw them again. I took some video again. Come over here into the den and look at it." So we looked at some of his video, and he kept putting in different segments. Now it was after, we arrived there a little after 9 o'clock, and time was ticking, and I said, well, you know, I'm here to investigate your sightings, and we can't tell too much about this video. As Tom says, it was out of focus. He had it on automatic focus, and we couldn't see very much in his video. So I asked him, I said, well, where did you observe these lights from? And he said, well, come on upstairs to the master bedroom, and outside of the master bedroom is a balcony that's facing south. And we were up there. Now, some of the neighbors, we went up there, and some of the neighbors were over, and in particular, I remember this blonde girl that kept talking about the lights. And when she got up there, she was pointing in different directions. She could see them to the southeast, to the south, to the north, and in different directions. And I was taking mental notes on this. And I remember distinctly it was around 9:45 when she shouted, "Look, there's one now." And I saw this very bright amber light come on up near the Estrella Mountains. So I took my binoculars and I immediately looked at them, and I could just make out the top of the Estrella Mountains in the moonlight. Now look very carefully at this, and just below the crest line of the mountains, now this is an important point, is this light. And the first thought that comes into my mind, is there a road up there? Is there somebody up on the mountain that just turned on this light? Because I was impressed by the fact that it was either on the mountain or just in front of the mountain. And it had to be, because I learned later there was a witness traveling along Pecos Road, and he worked for Steve, by the way, and he saw this light, and at his angle, he could not have seen it if it were beyond the mountain. At that time, Tom went downstairs and got his video equipment. I went and got my video equipment, and I guess he got some footage of that first light, but it went out. And then another one comes on that appeared to be a double light, two lights very close together. And I started up my video camera and it wouldn't work. I noticed the battery was depleted and went dead. Tom's camera was working fine, so he jumped up on the railing around the balcony and balanced himself up there so that he was at an elevated height, because now one light after another came on till we saw 4 lights beside the other 2 that were already brilliantly lit, and they just came on in sequence. And he started filming these, and he made the statement, major sighting going on here. And I decided, well, since I can't tape this, I'm going to look through Tom's telescope at it and get a really good look at this. And I did. It has a 24x or 25x magnification terrestrial celestron telescope. I have something like it now. Got a good view of what appeared to be a round, bright light pulsing, high-speed pulsation. And I looked all around the light. There was no smoke. There were no sparks. There was no parachute. We saw no aircraft, no helicopters around that area. Because one of the first things I wanted to rule out was, are we looking at flares? And I decided, no, what I'm looking at is an orb, and it is exactly what we saw up in the California deserts and around certain secret facilities in the California desert. And they have been seen to move and ascend and descend and even enter the ground. They've also have been seen to ascend and merge with a large object. But all we saw was this array without any vertical motion whatsoever and a 10-degree slant. And we couldn't see the rest of the formation as it appeared, and as other people videotaped it, apparently because that part of it was blocked out by houses and trees. And that's how low in elevation it was. Another peculiar thing about these lights is it seemed to me that it had a very pure color, the same kind of color that you see in a laser light. And in other words, the light was coherent, phase coherent, and of a single wavelength. And it appeared the most beautiful gold, and yet it had no glare or corona around it and was not illuminating anything. Now, in military operating areas, they drop flares to illuminate operations on the ground. That's the purpose of the flares, and these flares have a hell of a smoke column that comes up out of them. None of that was visible, and a flare also has a tail, and you can even see this in some of the video, and these were perfectly round. Now, this is a key, because later on, our local MUFON investigator, for reasons that aren't too clear to me yet, decided that these were flares, and that some unknown agency had dropped these at 8,900 feet altitude and beyond the Estrella Mountains. And the reason we saw them extinguish is that they fell behind the mountain. And I'm going, that's not the way I remember it. And I didn't know there were other witnesses that night or other people with video cameras out that night. And I'm not usually a witness, but I witnessed a lot of things over the last 40 years. I've had well over 100 sightings because I look up and I look for these things. And so I'm convinced, but I investigate other sightings, other stories, other happenings in order to try to add a few more pieces to this puzzle to try to understand what's going on. A technical adjustment here. Yeah, okay. Now, I can tell you from the history of UFO studies that the mass sightings over Arizona on March 13th were a highly significant event. And it was significant for a number of reasons. It was significant because in locations widely separated apart, several hundred, maybe even several thousand people witnessed one or more objects on the night of March 13th. Beginning in Henderson, Nevada at about 7:55, continuing at Paulden, Arizona at about 8:13, Prescott Valley, Dewey, Arizona, there were witnesses to a very large V-shaped formation. And then it entered the northwest sector of the Valley of the Sun up here around Glendale, and I talked to witnesses there, and was on a trajectory, a ground trajectory that was taking it southeast before it turned and crossed the flight path of approaching and departing aircraft at Sky Harbor Airport. But this wasn't the only thing that passed. And I focused a little bit more on a second object that people were talking about that did not match the description of this first object at all. And the second object was of interest to me because it is being seen all over the world, and they're having an unprecedented number of sightings of this type of object in England. And it was a big black flying triangle. How big? Witnesses have estimated, and I have some crude estimates on this, that it could have been as large as a mile from tip to tip. And at first, witnesses were describing this object as huge, enormous. And guess what? It blocked out the stars, and it had detailed structure that could be seen underneath it. Guess what else? It had these same kind of little amber lights, these orbs that we taped at around 10 o'clock, that were docked, let's say, right near the nose of this craft. And they were departing the craft and going off into the environment, as if they were probes being deployed into the environment, returning and redocking with this main structure. Now, one of our witnesses was coming up from Tucson, 5 people in the car, and just passing Casa Grande about a little after 8:30, they looked up and they saw this massive object as if it were using the freeway as a guide. And it had possibly 3 lights on the nose and a wing light on either side. And they said they were traveling as fast as 80 miles an hour on the I-10, and it took them a full 2 minutes to go from the bow of this object to the trailing edge. And in fact, when I asked her this question, I said, did you see any detail or structure on the bottom of this craft? And I did not want to hint that other witnesses had seen the structure and what that structure was. And they answered the same. And I'm convinced they saw the same craft. And at points in its flight path, it was traveling rapidly and then slowly. So it varied its velocity, and I do not think it was a lighter than aircraft, which will not vary its velocity like that. Neither was the V, because the V, we have witnesses in Prescott that said it accelerated like a rocket. We had other objects that night. We have claims by witnesses. In fact, there's one here present. May bring him up later to say what he saw. That saw F-16 fighter craft taking off from Luke Air Force Base on an intercept with some of these objects. Luke, the 56th Fighter Wing at Luke, they claim is only a training wing, and their craft only fly training missions at night, and they were not involved with the objects or lights over Phoenix. They said this in a document I have, which is a response to a Freedom of Information Act request. But I'm just going to take a few more minutes here again to come back and address this flare issue, because it raised its ugly head again. Later in the year, around July, I had a statement from Captain Eileen Benz. I requested it in writing. I said, please do as much research as possible and tell me if you know of any units that dropped flares on the night of March the 13th. She faxed me after about a week and stated that to the best of her knowledge and after completing her research, no unit of the Arizona National Guard jettisoned any flares or dropped any flares on that night. Luke Air Force Base already stated that they had no knowledge of any flares or where the story of flares got started. And then maybe 2 weeks after I received this statement in writing, I received another phone call from Captain Benz telling me I better read the paper the next day. For they had overlooked something, and that was a flight of 8 in the squadron of A-10s. They came down to Arizona on Operation Snowbird, landed at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, were given permission by Luke, supposedly, to go out to the Berry Goldwater Test Range, and on their return trip, they said they jettisoned flares. We understand that each A-10 carries 4 flares with it. If there were 8 aircraft, they had a minimum of 32 flares. But guess what? Here's an important point no one has addressed. And someone has even recently called the Maryland National Guard to verify this. They have repeatedly stated that the flares that they jettisoned were what are known as countermeasures. These are used as heat decoys for heat-seeking missiles. These flares are designated LUU-2 magnesium flares. What color do they burn? Bright white. White and hot. Now, anybody familiar with chemistry knows that if you take a Bunsen burner and you put a flame under various chemical elements, that you will get various colors, and you will get a color spectra. Okay, in other words, this spectral identification of elements is like a fingerprint for that particular element. And magnesium burns bright white. I've seen that. An electrical engineer I once worked for demonstrated this to me. Very flammable. And said that these would be visible for about 150 miles. And I started to ponder this because all of the witnesses claim but the color of the lights that we saw were amber, a kind of golden color, not white. And then we start getting contradictory information because the PIO at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, where these planes landed, Lieutenant Keith Shepard, issued a statement to the press. And he said, well, we thought all the planes were on the ground by 6 p.m., but we did further looking, and we found out that the Maryland National Guard was out there and landed at 8:30 p.m. after returning from the Phoenix area, and we believe that Mitch Stanley, who was a witness who saw airplanes through his telescope, saw this flight of A-10, and that they had dropped flares somewhere along the route. Now this is very interesting because when you hear the squadron leader for the Maryland National Guard on tape, he says they just flew a course out to the North Tack Range, and that's where they released their flares, and then they went back to Tucson. That didn't take them anywhere near Phoenix. And yet at no time have they said the time it was when they released those flares. I'm turning this around now because I think we have adequately demonstrated that some of these lights, which have been seen earlier that day and even later up to the next morning, and by other individuals moving in a horizontal plane, and even sometimes at other dates, people have seen these very orbs ascend very rapidly. Quite a trick for a flare. But what I'm getting at here now is turning this whole thing around. I am beginning to wonder why no one within sighting distance of the test range reported these very, it would have been for them, unusual sight of all of these white flares glowing so brightly. Where are the witnesses that saw these flares? We're so conditioned to believe the word of authorities when they step forward and said, here's what we did. Not even the newspapers question this. And I had some arguments with journalists from the Arizona Republic about flares. He said, well, why not accept the simplest explanation? And I wrote back and I said, because the simplest explanation, as you call it, doesn't fit the facts. Well, unfortunately, today's world, we live in a society that is increasingly becoming not only scientifically illiterate, but technically illiterate. And I'm even wondering, as a professional computer programmer analyst as I am, who's going to replace me in the generations in the future? Because I'm working with college kids right now that haven't even learned how to think on their own. So how can we expect the public to think about all the discrepancies in these reports? And I'm beginning to wonder whether it's a hoax. And the Maryland Air National Guard, that they conveniently pulled like a rabbit from a magician's hat, never dropped any flares in the first place. And I'm beginning to wonder whether Shepard said the planes landed at 8:30 and they made the flares magnesium and they have to stick to that story, was because originally they were trying to account for the white lights on the giant V and not for the videos. And that's what I'm coming to think about this whole story. So we're stuck again with a mystery. What were the V's? What was that giant triangle? Did you know that between 10 o'clock and 10:45 on that very night, another triangle was seen? And it was moving from west to east around Thunderbird Road. And the witness who saw it was a graphic artist, made a wonderful depiction of it. And I have the drawing out there on the poster board, if you see this. And guess what? I got an email on July 13th from a teenager who was camping up near Lake Pleasant, and he described seeing the same kind of triangle with the cutout V. In fact, I found out there were 3 of them up there around July 13th. So this phenomena, by the way, this flap that happened over Arizona was in the middle of a worldwide flap. So if we place it in context, we have found out that there has been a significant increase in sightings, not only here in the United States, but in England has an unprecedented number of sightings. In fact, I was told by Graham Birdsall, the highest ever. Australia is having very strange activity. And just before I went over to Italy, I received an email from our director in Chile that stated that the Chilean Air Force has now established an official investigative group to look into the UFO problem there in Chile. And they are going to maintain an open communication line with the civilian research group down there, and they promise not to censor any information, and they are going to send military personnel over to get training in France. So now we have official acknowledgement. We've had official acknowledgement of UFOs from various governments, but not the United States government, which continues to remain in denial. Well, we got started a little late, but I'm going to cut my talk a little short. But even before I bring Tom King up here to finish this, I've been asked to bring Frances Barwood up here, who has been the very brave councilwoman who asked the city to investigate these sightings. And I want her to come up here and tell you whatever she has to tell you. Please welcome Frances. Am I holding this?
Well, it's been interesting. I'm not used to standing behind a podium. I'm not tall enough to discuss it. The way that they deal with it is attacks. And as you all know, I've been attacked a lot. And I usually tell people I used to be 6'2", but you know. and even Jim Schneebel said to me, and he's got a lot of things that he's found out about, and he said he's waiting for the attacks on his credibility to come, because he's really delving into things a lot. And people are getting nervous. It just seems strange to me when common sense and logic is, why not find out? Why not let anybody know? I mean, how long are they going to keep whatever it was a secret? Eventually, everybody's going to know, and there's not going to be any hiding it. And so why not treat us like adults instead of kind of like subjects under an elitist system? And I hate to say that because I'm part of the government. But the thing is that I've come across an awful lot of people in government that won't even talk to me because of that. And that's really very sad. And it seems to me that there's an awful lot of people that are afraid, and it's kind of like, you know, the king's new clothes. Everybody's afraid to say that the king is naked. And the fact is that the king is naked. And we're going to have to deal with that. And so be prepared. I'm going to be, I don't know if I can say this, but I'm going to be running for Secretary of State this next year. And they've already told me that my political career is over, and I said I'm not a career politician. I'm kind of you do things because you should do them. If I win, I win. If I lose, I win. I'll have a 9-to-5 job, no nights, no weekends. And it just seems strange to me that they would go to the point of telling me that if I keep asking, that my career is over. And that I'm the youngest of 5 children. That just makes me more determined to do something. So at the very least, I'm going to give them an interesting time and probably a pretty good fight. I may not win, but be prepared for an awful lot of attacks on me, my family, whatever. So far, the only things that they've come up with have been, nothing personal. As far as I know, I've never done anything personally wrong. but they just don't seem to like when people ask a question and when they're told to be quiet, they're not quiet. And it's very, very important that wherever you come from, whatever town you come from, whatever state you come from, that you really support your elected officials in the fact of asking and not being afraid to ask. And it's really sad when what we consider third world countries are not afraid. Mexico, Chile, so many others are right out there. And here we are, and we can't even ask because they'll destroy you. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Francis, and you got to watch these petite women. They are fighters, I'll tell you. Okay, I want to bring up here the all-time